At the time, he was arguably the best-known photographer in the country. He was the first designated photographer to the president in history. Access like no other photographer has had before or since.
He talked to Johnson and he said, I will be your photographer if I only work for you. None of his special assistants could ask him to leave.
He was one of only 2 people on the entire White House staff, including his chief of staff, that could walk into the private residence unannounced. One was Mrs. Johnson's personal secretary, and the other one was Dad. You'd be hard-pressed not to have seen some of his work. Now, you no doubt didn't realize it, but Yoichi Okamoto was my father.
And everybody called him Okie. All the staff did, the secretaries, because he liked that kind of familiarity with the people that he was working with.
My grandfather was, in the late 1800s, he was a samurai. And that's when samurais were on the way out, okay? And he realized that you can't make a living doing this anymore, and immigrated to the United States. At one point, not long after Pearl Harbor, my grandmother and my uncle were both put in an internment camp somewhere out in Kansas. Of course, he saw, as did my grandmother and my uncle, saw a substantial amount of prejudice. His mother told him at a comparatively young age that he had to be very careful to stay clean. He said, "We smell different." And consequently, for as long as I can remember, when he come home from work every night, he'd go up and change clothes, get out of his suit, but he always washed his feet every evening. And that was as a result of his mother telling him that. So, Dad joined the Army shortly after Pearl Harbor. His mother was no doubt not crazy about the idea, but she also understood, because Dad was very passionate about being an American. He was also very self-conscious about being a Nisei Japanese, Nisei being first-generation American, but very much wanted to prove to everyone that he was a patriot. He served during World War II. He was initially assigned with the 442nd Regiment, which is all Japanese. He was in Officer Candidate School because he had a college degree. And at some point during that OCS, he was called into a CO's office and simply informed that he was being dismissed from OCS. No reason given. Reason being he was Japanese, of course, but they're not going to say that, So he went overseas to Europe, then was assigned to General Clark as his photographer. He was, in the early days in Vienna, he was a big Leica fan. At some point while he was still at USAA, he went to Nikon's, and he stayed with Nikon's the rest of the time. The camera in there is a Nikon. The camera at the Smithsonian is a Nikon.
I mean, when he was in Vienna, Edward Steichen came to him and said, "Get me a bunch of photographers from Europe and come to Paris. I want to talk to you." He knew the movers and shakers in photography and photojournalism in Europe very, very well.
He met my mother in Vienna while he was stationed over there after the war. Did a lot of photography there. That work is what the Austrian government was so interested in. And in some ways, he is better known over there than he is here. He got a call one day from Edward R. Murrow, who was head of USA at the time, Vice President Johnson. He was getting ready to go to Berlin, and it was the agency's responsibility to furnish a photographer for him. Edward Murrow asked Dad, he said, "Would you be willing to go? I'd consider it a personal favor. It is not your job, I know that." And Dad said, "Well, yes, sir, I'd be happy to go." He said, "Good." He said, "Call your wife, tell her to pack a bag because you're getting on a plane at 4 o'clock this afternoon." So they sent a White House car out to pick up his luggage, and away they went to Berlin. Long story short, Johnson just raved about the photographs. So the next trip he went on was to Jamaica, and that time Johnson specifically asked for my father, and of course he went. Well, that was history. And then Kennedy was assassinated. In January of '64, Johnson personally called my dad at his office. And my father, who was generally a pretty easy guy to get along with, told him no 3 times. Until Johnson sweetened the pot, which had nothing to do with money. Dad's foremost thing was, if he was going to truly tell the story of what the life of the President of the United States was like, he had to have access to all that, whether the President liked it or not. He told the President, if I'm going to do this, this is how it's got to be, or find somebody else. LBJ and my dad got to be quite close over the years. They hit it off right away from the first trip to Berlin, and that just grew from there. Dad told me one time that the president was, in many ways, a very vain man, and he wanted pictures taken from the left. If you notice photographs, there are very few photographs that are not from the left side, or at least the left is predominant. When he would take pictures, he would try to become part of the furniture. He didn't want anybody to notice him, didn't want anybody paying attention to him. So 99% of everything he shot was candid. Dad hated taking posed photographs. From time to time he had to do that, but by and large he did not like doing posed photographs. He wanted to do everything candid.
I'm from a town of 7,000 people in the middle of Pennsylvania. And all of a sudden, bingo, a couple of years after graduation from high school in the White House. For as important as my learning the nuts and bolts of photography at Rochester Institute of Technology, Okamoto was just that important for me, learning how to become a real photographer. This was done near the end of the administration, I think. What I basically did was hide behind the camera and just keep pushing the button when I first got there. I mean, just to make sure I was exposing film. In the evenings when we were on our late shift, I would sometimes sit there and just look through his contact sheets and see how he was photographing. Because Oki was the man, if you will. He was the one who had the stuff to go about doing this in an extraordinary way.
Creativity was Dad's real strong point. He had an eye like hard to imagine. And there are many other photographers, and he knew a slew of them, of course, that will agree with that. He felt people, by and large, were good. He felt very strongly about a lot of the human tragedy. He was very aware of the Holocaust, particularly in Vienna, because so many Austrian and German and Polish and Russian Jews were persecuted so badly. His Japanese heritage, to him, while he was proud of it, he was also very self-conscious of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the war.
And when the German chancellor came to the ranch, Okamoto was there and he was photographing. One of the guys came up, one of the staff members came up and started speaking Japanese to him. Oki, in his fluent German, answered him that he didn't speak Japanese. The guy turned on his heels and walked off. So that's sort of how Oki was.
I have never seen anyone in any field as dedicated to accomplishing what his goal, particularly at the White House, was. He was so driven to do the very best job he could. I would say that his biggest regret towards the tail end of his life was that he was losing his creativity. To me, it was apparent on a nearly daily basis, because he would come home and you could tell he felt, man, it was a good day, or, boy, I just didn't get it done today, So he held himself to a very, very high standard. Dad fell into a pretty deep depression, felt very ignorant, and felt that the technological advances were above his head. He was seeking professional help, had been for a while. The doctor put him on Valium when it first came out. Dad thought, oh, good, he's going to give me a pill. I'll take a pill for a couple days and I'll be fine. Of course, Valium doesn't work like that, And he just one day decided he'd had enough and committed suicide while my mother was out at the market. She used to go to the farmer's market in Bethesda every week, and she would walk. She would always walk. And then he would pick her up. And he never showed up to pick her up. And she called, and he didn't answer the phone. She tried several more times. And I got a call from her about 10 o'clock that morning. And it was a Saturday, as I recall. And she told me what he'd done. Well, she passed 7 years later. He was cremated, as was his wish for both of them. It was very meaningful for me to be able to pour them in the same urn, so they were back together again. And that's what we buried. And of course, I go there every time we go to DC. He felt extremely honored and obligated to the profession and to the art form. He was always very conscious that he had to do the best job every day he possibly could because of the importance of what he was doing. We're at the LBJ Library to see this exhibit centered around my father's work. I have not seen it before. I've never been to the library before. A lot of it caught me by surprise. It's a very good collection of him as a human being, just as a man. And quite frankly, I still miss him every day.